Internationalism or Extinction. Noam Chomsky. He has been an American linguist, philosopher, political scientist, and activist. Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and one of the leading figures in 20th-century linguistics, thanks to his work in linguistic theory and cognitive science. Internationalism or Extinction. We meet at an extraordinary moment, a unique moment in human history, a moment that is both an ominous omen and a promising hope for a better future. The Progressive International has a crucial role to play in determining the course of history. We find ourselves at a time of confluence of different crises of extraordinary gravity, before which the fate of the human experiment is literally at stake. In a few weeks, problems will come to a head in the two great imperial powers of the modern era. Britain is in the dark and, having publicly declared that it rejects international law, is on the verge of an abrupt break with Europe, on the way to becoming even more of an American satellite. But, of course, for the future the most relevant thing is what happens in the world hegemony, less undermined by the destructive power of Trump, but still possessing overwhelming power and incomparable advantages. His fate, and with it the fate of the world, may be determined in November. No wonder the rest of the world is worried and even horrified. It is difficult to find a more sensible and respected commentator than Martin Wolf of the London Financial Times. He writes that the West is facing a serious crisis and that if Trump is re-elected, the crisis will be terminal. They are strong words, but they do not refer to the great crises facing humanity. Wolf refers to the global order, a critical issue although not of the magnitude of the crises that threaten much more serious consequences, the crises that are moving the hands of the famous doomsday clock towards midnight, towards extinction. Wolf's concept of terminal is not a new addition to public discourse. We have lived in its shadow for 75 years since we learned, on one unforgettable day in August, that human intelligence had found the means that would soon provide a capacity for terminal destruction. That was devastating, but there was more. At that moment, it was not understood that humanity was entering a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, in which human activities plunder the environment in such a way that it is headed for terminal destruction. The hands of the doomsday clock were first placed shortly after atomic bombs were used in a paroxysm of needless carnage. Since then, the hands have oscillated according to the evolution of global events. With each year that Trump was in office, the hands moved closer to midnight. 2 years ago they were closer than ever. Last January, analysts stopped counting the minutes and started calculating the seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. They cited the same crises as before, the growing threats of nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, and the deterioration of democracy. At first, the latter may seem of place, but it is not. The decline of democracy is certainly part of the ominous trio. The only hope of escaping the two threats of extinction is a vibrant democracy in which interested and informed citizens are fully engaged in deliberation, policy making and direct action. That was in January of this year. Since then, President Trump has managed to increase the three threats, which is not a minor thing. It continued with the destruction of the arms control regime, which offered some protection against the threat of nuclear war, while promoting the development of new and even more dangerous weapons, much to the delight of the military industry. Faced with this firm commitment to destroy the environment that supports life, Trump enabled oil exploitation in vast new areas, including the last great natural reserve. Meanwhile, his minions are systematically dismantling the regulatory system that somewhat mitigates the destructive impact of fossil fuel use and protects people from toxic chemicals and pollution, a curse that is now doubly murderous. During the course of a severe respiratory epidemic, Trump also carried out his campaign to undermine democracy. By law, appointments to office by the president are subject to Senate ratification. Trump circumvents this inconvenience by leaving the positions vacant and filling the offices with temporary appointments that respond to his will. If they don't do it with enough loyalty to the Lord, they are fired. It has stripped the executive of any independent voice. Only sycophants remain. Congress had long ago established the Office of the Inspector General to monitor the performance of the executive branch. The inspectors began to investigate the morass of corruption that Trump created in Washington. To resolve this quickly, he fired them. The Republican Senate, firm under Trump's control, hardly expressed itself, without a hint of integrity, terrified by the popular base that Trump mobilizes. This assault on democracy is only the beginning. Trump's most recent action was to warn that he will not leave office if he is not satisfied with the outcome of the November election. In high places, the threat is taken very seriously. To mention just a few examples, 2 senior military commanders, well-respected retirees, published an open letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, stressing his constitutional responsibility to send the military to forcibly remove an illegal president who refuses to leave office after an electoral defeat, and that he summons in his defense the type of paramilitary units that he sent to Portland, Oregon, to terrorize the population that strongly opposed the elected officials. Many figures within the ruling elite consider the warning to be realistic, including members of the well-known Transition Integrity Project, which has just reported the results of a war game it conducted to simulate the possible outcomes of the November elections. The members of the project are some of the most prominent Republicans, Democrats, public officials, media experts, pollsters, and strategists, explains the co-director of the project, which includes relevant figures from both parties. In any possible scenario, except for a clear victory for Trump, the games led to something similar to a civil war in which Trump decides to end the American experiment. Once again, these are strong words, never before spoken by the authoritative sensible voices. The very fact that such thoughts arise is quite ominous. They are not isolated. And given the unparalleled power of the United States, much more than the American experiment is at risk. Nothing like this has ever happened in the turbulent history of parliamentary democracy. Without going any further, Richard Nixon, who was not the most charming person in presidential history, had good reason to believe that he had lost the 1960 election due solely to criminal manipulation by Democratic operatives. He put the welfare of the country before personal ambition and did not challenge the results. Albert Gore did the same thing in the year 2000. It won't be like that today. It is not enough for the megalomaniac who dominates the world to forge new paths with total disregard for the welfare of the country. Trump also announced once again that he may not abide by the Constitution and negotiate a third term if he decides he is entitled to it. Some choose to laugh at all this as if it were the jocularity of a buffoon. At your own risk, as history shows. The survival of freedom is not guaranteed by parchment barriers, warned James Madison. Words on paper are not enough. It is based on the expectation of good faith and common decency. Trump tore it apart with the help of his co-conspirator, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who turned the greatest deliberative chamber in the world, as he calls himself, into a pathetic joke. McConnell's Senate refuses to even consider legislative proposals. It cares about giving to the rich and amassing judicial power, from the top down, through young far-right lawyers focused on safeguarding the reactionary Trump-McConnell agenda for a generation, no matter what the public wants, no matter what that the world needs to survive. The abject service to the rich by the Trump-McConnell Republican Party is quite notorious, even by neoliberal standards of exalting greed. It is evident in the example provided. The main specialists in fiscal policy, the economists Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman. They describe that in 2018, after the tax swindle that can be considered the only Trump-McConnell legislative achievement, for the first time in the last 100 years, billionaires paid less taxes than steel workers, teachers, and retirees, which made a century of fiscal history disappear. In 2018, for the first time in the modern history of the United States, capital has been taxed less than labor, which constitutes a truly impressive victory for the class war, called freedom in the hegemonic doctrine. The doomsday clock was set last January before the scale of the pandemic was understood. humanity will recover sooner or later from the pandemic, at a terrible price. It is an unnecessary cost. It can be seen clearly in the experience of countries that took decisive action when China provided the world with relevant information about the virus on January 10. Among them, the main ones are in East and Southeast Asia, and Oceania. Other laggards followed slowly. Attitude, to the rear, and caused real disasters, in particular the United States, Bolsonaro's Brazil, and Modi's India. Despite the malfeasance or indifference that characterizes some political leaders, there will eventually be some kind of recovery from the pandemic. However, we will not recover from the melting of the polar ice caps, nor from the escalating fires in the Arctic that are releasing huge amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, nor from the other steps we are taking towards catastrophe. When leading climate scientists warn us that we should panic now, they are not being alarmist. There is no time to lose. Few are doing enough, and worse, the world is cursed by leaders who not only refuse to take the necessary action, but deliberately accelerate the race to disaster. The wickedness of the White House leads this monstrous criminality. It's not just governments. The same goes for the fossil fuel industry, the big banks that finance it, and other industries that benefit from actions that put the survival of humanity is at serious risk, according to a leaked internal memo from the largest bank in the United States. Humanity will not survive this institutional perversity. The means to manage the crisis are available, but not for long. One of the main tasks of the Progressive International is to ensure that we all panic now and act accordingly. The crises we face at this unique moment in human history are, of course, international. Environmental catastrophe, nuclear war, and pandemic do not distinguish borders. Less obviously, the same thing happens with the third demon that haunts the earth and pushes the second hand of the doomsday clock towards midnight, the deterioration of democracy. The international character of this plague becomes clear when we analyze its origins. The circumstances vary, but they have common origins. Much of the wickedness has endured for the last 40 years. Internationalism or extinction. As a consequence of the neoliberal assault on the world population. The basic character of the assault was reflected in the initial pronouncements of its most prominent figures. Ronald Reagan declared in his inaugural address that government is the problem, not the solution, which means that decisions must be moved from governments, which are to some extent under public control, to private power, which is not accountable to the public, and whose sole responsibility is self-enrichment, as the renowned economist Milton Friedman proclaimed. Another figure was Margaret Thatcher, who showed that there is no society, only a market in which people are destined to survive in the best possible way, without organizations that allow them to defend themselves from its ravages. Without knowing it, Thatcher was paraphrasing Marx, who condemned the autocratic rulers of his day for turning the population into a sack of potatoes defenseless against concentrated power. The Reagan and Thatcher administrations set out immediately and with admirable consistency to destroy the labor movement, the principal main obstacle for the masters of the economy to achieve brutal class rule. In doing so, they adopted the guiding principles of neoliberalism established during its early days in interwar Vienna, where the movement's founder and patron saint, Ludwig von Mises, barely managed to control his bliss when the proto-fascist government violently destroyed Austria's vibrant social democracy and despicable trade unions that were interfering with the strong economy by defending workers' rights. As von Mises explained in his 1927 neoliberal classic Liberalism, 5 years after Mussolini launched his brutal regime, it cannot be denied that fascism and similar movements that seek to establish dictatorships are filled with the best of intentions. And that his intervention, for the time being, has saved European civilization. The credit that fascism has earned for itself will live forever in history, although he assured us that it would only be temporary. The black shirts would go home after completing their satisfactory work. The same principles inspired enthusiastic neoliberal support for the appalling dictatorship. Internationalism or extinction. Pinochet's era. Years later, they were put to work on the world stage in a different way under the leadership of the United States and the United Kingdom. The consequences were predictable. One was the strong concentration of wealth together with the stagnation of a large part of the population, which in the political arena was reflected in the undermining of democracy. The impact in the United States shows very clearly what to expect when the business norm is virtually unchallenged. After 40 years, 0.1% of the population concentrates 20% of the wealth, double what it had when Reagan was elected. CEO salaries skyrocketed, dragging down general management capital with them. The real wages of male workers who do not hold supervisory positions fell. The majority of the population survives from paycheck to paycheck, with almost no savings. Financial institutions, largely predatory, expanded in scale. There have been repeated crises, increasingly serious, in which the perpetrators have been bailed out by the kind taxpayer, despite the fact that this is the least of the implicit state subsidies they receive. The free markets led to monopolization and reduced competition and innovation, as the strong engulfed the weak. Neoliberal globalization deindustrialized the country within the framework of investor rights agreements mislabeled as free trade agreements. By embracing the neoliberal doctrine that taxes are theft, Reagan opened the door to tax havens and shell companies, previously banned and restricted by effective law enforcement. Immediately, this situation gave rise to a huge tax evasion industry to accelerate massive theft from the general population by the wealthiest and the corporate sector. The change did not go unnoticed. The scale is estimated to be in the tens of billions of dollars. The situation was perpetuated, and the neo-liberal took hold. At the time the assault was just beginning to take shape, in 1978, United Auto Workers President Doug Fraser resigned from a labor management committee that had been set up by the Carter administration, expressing shock that business leaders would have chosen to wage a unilateral class war in this country, a war against the workers, the unemployed, the poor, minorities, the youngest and the oldest, and even against many members of the middle class of our society, and would have broken and discarded the fragile implicit pact that had previously existed during the period of growth and progress, during the period of collaboration between classes under regimented capitalism. Their understanding of the workings of the world was somewhat late, in fact too late to defend against the bitter class war started by business leaders who were soon given free rein by obedient governments. The consequences in much of the world are not surprising: widespread anger, resentment, contempt for political institutions, while major economic problems are kept hidden from view by effective propaganda. All of this provides fertile ground for demagogues who can pretend to be your savior while stabbing you in the back. While they deflect attention away from blame for your conditions through scapegoats, immigrants, blacks, China, whoever fits the old prejudices. Going back to the great crises that we face at this historical moment, they are all international, and two internationals are being formed to face them. One begins today, the Progressive International. The other has been taking shape under the leadership of the Trump White House, a reactionary international that includes the most reactionary states in the world. In the Western Hemisphere, the international includes Bolsonaro's Brazil and a few others. In the Middle East, the main members are the hereditary dictatorships of the Gulf, the Egyptian dictatorship of al-Sisi, perhaps the harshest in Egypt's bitter history, and Israel, which long ago discarded its social democratic origins and moved to the right, an effect that was expected to result from a prolonged and brutal occupation. The current agreements between Israel and the Arab dictatorships, which formalize long-standing tacit relations, are a significant step towards the consolidation of the reactionary international in the Middle East. The Palestinians. They suffer a devastating failure, which turns out to be the marked fate of those who lack power and do not properly grovel at the feet of natural masters. In the East, a natural candidate is India, where Prime Minister Modi is destroying India's secular democracy and turning the country into a racist Hindu nationalist state while crushing Kashmir. The European contingent includes Orbán's illiberal democracy in Hungary and similar elements elsewhere. The international also has powerful backing from the dominant global economic institutions. Both internationals cover a large part of the world, one at the level of states and the other at the level of popular movements. Each prominently represents much broader social forces, whose images of the world that should emerge from the current pandemic are diametrically opposed. A force is working tirelessly to build a tougher version of the global system. Neoliberalism, from which it benefited considerably, through more intense surveillance and controls. The other yearns for a world of justice and peace, where energies and resources are devoted to meeting human needs rather than the demands of a small minority. It is a kind of class struggle on a global scale, with many facets and complex interactions. It is no exaggeration to say that the fate of the human experiment depends on the outcome of this struggle. And now we have the task of getting to work. Finish. Internationalism or extinction. Noam Chomsky.